Hi everyone. Thanks again for taking the time to watch this third and final sermon debrief. The sermon series is going to wrap up on Sunday, but this is going to be the last sermon debrief that I'll post on YouTube. This series, The Art of Neighbouring, looking at how we can love and care for those who live right next door. How can we take the command of Jesus to love our neighbors as literally as possible? That's what the series has been all about. And it's been a lot of fun journeying with you, asking some of these questions of barriers and obstacles that we face as well. This past Sunday, I spoke about fear and how fear can get in the way of loving our neighbors. Fear is such an obstacle, even in our culture, and especially for neighboring. Fear stops us from stepping out our front door and getting to know our neighbors. It might be fear of having to get to know someone new. It might be fear of what's really going on in this person's life. Do I really want to step into that? And then finally, one of the fears I talked about on Sunday was a fear of a long-term commitment. That's truly what neighboring is. If things go south with neighboring, our only option is to pack up and move away. And that's not a very good option for us. So it can be scary entering into these long-term commitments with our neighbors. But Christ calls us to love those around us, to love our neighbors, even if it's a little bit scary at sometimes. I think an important thing to remember, especially when it comes to our fears, is to realize that our neighbors are probably facing these exact same fears. They're worried about the people around them, especially if they don't know them. Knowing someone, getting to know their name, getting to know a little bit about them can help to expel some of these fears, first of all. But if our neighbors are facing the same fears we are, how can we approach them in a non-threatening way? How can we approach our neighbors in a comfortable way? In a way that doesn't have to be filled with fear for anyone involved? Perhaps baking is a way to do that. I've mentioned that a few times throughout our series, bringing fresh baking to your neighbors around you. But one of the things I suggested on Sunday was living life a little bit more in the front yard. Now, I know that this doesn't apply to everyone. Some people's front yards are their living space, and that's great. So how can we live life in a front yard in a way that when a neighbor passes by or drives by, you can interact with them even a little bit. Check in with how their day is going. On your front yard is a neutral space. No one has to feel fearful of that. No one's knocking on their front door asking about what their name is. And so it's non-threatening. One hope of these interactions in your front yard is that you'll get to know your neighbors' names. And that brings us back to the very first sermons of the sermon series, getting to know your neighbors' names. I think as soon as you know what the names of your neighbors are, that's going to start to expel a lot of the fears right off the bat. You not only have a face, but you have a name to put with that face. When it comes to our fears about our neighbors, we first have to acknowledge them. We have to discern if caution is the right path or whether we're exercising a little bit too much caution and that our fears aren't justified. And then we also have to acknowledge that our neighbors are facing fears as well. They don't know who you are either or what you're all about. And somebody needs to take that first step. Somebody needs to break the cycle of fear, step out that front door, and introduce themselves. It's only when someone breaks the cycle of fear that everyone's fears can be expelled, yours and your neighbors. So why not you? Why not take that first step out the door? Why not be the first one to stick out your hand, shake your neighbor's hand, and ask them what their name is? Apologize if you've been there a while for not having learned it earlier. There are so many benefits to being a good neighbor, both practical and relational. You might need a tool sometime that your neighbor has, and you can run over and borrow it. And you're going to have relationships and friendships with those around you. You're not going to live in fear of not knowing who the strangers next door are. They're going to be friends instead. One thing that I really appreciated in my reading this past week was a line that said, if you don't know who your neighbors are next door, then there's a blessing waiting for you. You never know who's going to be there and what ways you might be blessed in getting to know them. Thank you so much for participating in this sermon series, in these sermon debriefs with your care groups. I hope that it's been a really good experience for you. I hope you'll join us on Sunday as we wrap up the sermon series with one last sermon slot, and I hope you have a great week as well.